Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first open office hours for the 2021 Outdoor Equity Fund. I'm Axie Navis. I'm the director of the Outdoor Recreation Division, and I'm joined by Alyssa, project coordinator for the division, and my awesome teammates. So we are here to walk through some of the specifics of how do you apply for the Outdoor Equity Fund. That deadline is coming up in just about 3 weeks. June 30th is when it closes. So we want to get into some of those technical specifics about how you apply, who's eligible, and we want to keep it really informal and conversation based. So if you have questions, you can shout them out. I believe folks are going to be
Axie, can you hear me? Okay, I think at least on my end, you were in and out there. I couldn't hear you for a little bit, so. I just attempted to unmute you all. Oh yeah, so I see a question here about Axie muting herself. So, Axie, do you want to try to speak again? See if we can hear you. I muted you. Well, I just attempted to unmute everyone. So like Axie said, this could be interactive.
Oh, I think it's back now. So I don't know how much of that folks caught. I might have gotten cut out in the last like 10 seconds, but I was really just wrapping it up to say thank you, Alyssa, and thank you all for joining us today. And we do want it to be informal and conversational and not just your typical webinar, because we're really here to talk less about the big picture of this first of its kind fund, which I imagine many of you are pretty familiar with that story, and hear more to show up and answer your specific questions about the program guide, about the application, and about any of those technical details. And with the final shout out, just to remember that the deadline to apply for the Outdoor Equity Fund is June 30th. So coming up pretty quickly, which is why we want to have 2 of these sessions. The next one's going to be in 2 weeks. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alyssa. Thanks, Alyssa, and thank you all for joining us.
So like Axie said, we're actually going to keep this pretty brief from our end. We're going to do a quick overview, and then we really want to leave the bulk of the time for you guys to ask your questions. I have an eye on the question box, and I tried to unmute you all. Not sure if it worked. If it worked, you should have control of your own audio now, be able to unmute yourself. So if anybody wants to try, you're welcome to do that, and let me know in the question box if that's, yes, it works. I see from Bruce. Awesome. So
hi.
Hey there. Perfect. So yeah, we're gonna feel free to jump in at any time with questions. I'm gonna do a pretty brief 10-15 minute at the max overview, and then the floor will be all of yours for your questions, as broad or specific as those may be. So I'm going to start with, I think you all should know, this is what obviously the page looks like when you click on the apply button for the application. It should all come up here. It should be pretty straightforward, so we're not going to really dive into it. The main thing here I wanted to make sure you all are aware of was this blue question mark button up here at the top. If you click on it, this will take you to this help page at Submittable, and if you can obviously peruse kind of their help center, and then if you have any questions, there's this form here. So they're amazing, super responsive. They, at the very least, get back in 24 hours. Typically, in my experience, it's been a few hours, if not even within an hour. So if you have, we've had a few people that have had some issues with logging in, signing in, creating an account. Patsy and I are pretty limited in what we can see account-wise on our side. So this is just your best bet, is just shooting them a message. And then, like I said, typically even within a few hours, they'll get back to you and we'll be able to help you sort out any issues you may have. And then you should see this message here on the side that mentions that if you have questions about the actual application status, you can reach out to me or Axie, and we can quickly log in and let you know if you want to double check that it was received or anything like that. That's something we can handle on our end. Any questions about the actual application itself? Kind of submittable side of things so far that anyone has? Taking silence as either unmute's not working or no. Okay, so I wanted to hop over to this program guide, which is available on our website. Hopefully you've all taken a look at up to this point. And just to touch on, like Axie's, a few of these points here briefly. In terms of the eligible applicants, you can see those there. It's essentially everyone except private business. That has been a question we've gotten up to this point, and we encourage private businesses to partner with these eligible entities. We love to see those public-private partnerships, but the actual application needs to come from one of these eligible entities. The other place we've gotten questions is around this serve a population where at least 40% are low income. And so this was written into the creation of the fund, and we have no set definition or parameters around that. I think you'll see in the application we ask about it, but like I said, we don't provide a direct definition of what we mean by that, and we leave that kind of broad intentionally and up to you guys. We don't want this question or this requirement to be a barrier. We know it can be in terms of collecting, say, income information from families or participants when you register them or sign them up for your program, those kind of things. And obviously we don't want to create an unnecessary barrier there around that. So if your own organization has a definition they use for what's low income, you're welcome to use that. Just explain that in the question. And then you're welcome to use obviously whatever just data you have access to, whether that's county, city level data. And then also in the past we've had folks, you can go on the PED website, and I'm happy to, if anybody's interested, shoot me an email and I'll send it to you. Access for your reduced school lunch data. So if you're recruiting kids, obviously that's relevant to a certain community or kids from certain school districts. That's one way also that we've seen folks essentially, verify that the majority of at least 40% of their kids are coming from low income areas. Like Axie mentioned here, again, June 30th specifically at 5 p.m. is the cutoff time. Seeing here if I had any other specific questions that have come up from folks so far. There is a match requirement. Again, we try to be pretty as flexible and broad around that as we can be. Once again, we don't want that to be a barrier in itself. So we're pretty lenient in terms of that, particularly that in-kind side, or that's equipment, materials, volunteer hours in particular. You can, I think there's a website you can look up or just Google the current volunteer, like the national volunteer hourly rate, which is typically $21 and some change. So that gets you pretty far in terms of volunteer hours. And then I had a note, one other question we've gotten up to this point is around if I know some of your organizations tack on some, say, admin, facilities type fees. So basically whatever the grant amount you apply for is the exact amount and the exact max we will award. So if that type of fee comes on at the end, you will just have to factor that into the grant amount itself, as we won't tack on that amount after the grant's been awarded. So I'm actually going to stop there and open up questions. Axie and I will tag team answering them. I see a request. You guys feel free. Hopefully I heard someone try. I see Bruce, your question about the entity can define their term of what we consider low income. Essentially, yes. Again, we left that question broad in the application. We just need to see some, which in New Mexico, majority of our folks are coming from low income areas, so we don't truly feel it's an issue to obviously meet that requirement. But yeah, just explain how you are going about that and essentially show us that that's being met, whatever that means in terms of that low income definition.
On two other points that I'll just put a fine emphasis on, an awesome job. Thank you, Alyssa. But these are changes from last year. So if there are folks on this call who applied for the Outdoor Equity Fund in 2020, these are two updates I want to flag for you specifically. And that's that award range now has a ceiling of $20,000. So it goes $1,500 to $20,000, as you can see in the program guide. And then the other part that I'll just put a really fine emphasis on is that the programming must be completed within 18 months now of that signed contract rather than 12 months. We wanted to build in a little bit more flexibility for applicants and for all the groups that are doing this amazing work on the ground. And that also means that you have that full 18 months to get your program off and running. And so maybe you have programming that's ongoing, that's happening in June 2021, and you want to apply for a 2021 Outdoor Equity Fund for programming next spring in 2022, summer 2022. That would all be totally eligible. And it really is based on some of the feedback we heard about a need for flexibility and wanting to make it as easy as possible to actually get this money on the ground in your communities.
I do have a question. We currently have a program that gets kids out on nature-based field trips at least 3 times a year, as well as a camping trip. And I'm working with our director to see if possibly we could expand it more. But one of our current pressing needs that we are seeking through other funders is a newer type transportation vehicle, and I'm wondering if any type of funds might be allotted, if that would be an allowable type expense. It said transportation, but I think a van is a capital thing, so I'm not sure how you would define that.
Yeah, no, I was gonna let you go ahead. Yeah,
I'll take that one. Yeah, I was gonna say really how big picture Outdoor Equity Fund is a programming grant. So what we want to see in the applications is how is this application, this programming getting more kids outside in those nature-based experiences, which it sounds like you're doing and which would be totally eligible. Buying a van outside of that bigger picture of the programming, I think would be borderline, and it's going to depend a little bit on the application. Maybe you need some money to finalize that purchase, and then you have that transportation, and that's going to lead to getting this additional group of kids outside, and that's kind of the narrative we would need to see within the application itself. A straight up purchase of a van would not be eligible. But if it is part of this broader application and part of the vision to actually put programming on the ground, then it sounds like it would be eligible. That's probably about as specific as I can go without getting a little bit more detail, but hopefully that helps. And yeah, happy to follow up on that. Or Alyssa, is there anything you think I mischaracterized? Anything you want to add?
Nope. I think that's exactly how I was gonna. And I think, in that example about transportation, there's a lot of groups out there that, are renting vans or renting buses, whatever it is, to transport those kids. That's what we've seen up to this point, which is supported if it requires some transportation costs to get these kids to these public lands that are being utilized. I'm going to looking at questions currently in the chat or in the question box. Emily, I see you asked about providing that PED link to free and reduced lunch percentages. It will take me a second to find it on the PED website because you have to go about 12 layers deep, but we do have all your emails for everyone that registered. So once we get off, I will do that, and then I can shoot that out that way to all of you, so you have that at your fingertips. I have a question here, Axie. I'll let you take. It says, can grant administration hours be included in match?
So staff time is included as an eligible expense. And I would also say, like, within that broader look, if you're putting staff time towards the actual application, the process, I would say yes, that you can use that admin time to actually count towards that in-kind match because it is part of the work of getting it on the ground. But we just, your case is going to be made better, to be honest. Like, that's my short answer. But the more specific you can be, the better. And so maybe you're counting, let's say 10 hours of grant admin time towards the match. We want to see that broken up pretty specifically, or rather your application will be stronger if you break that up really specifically and then show what else is being contributed as match. Because obviously the grant admin, and that's why I think it's a little tricky, right, is all pre-programming. Our goal really with asking for a match at all is just to work with groups that are already doing this work, where hopefully this builds capacity, but it's also building on an investment of time, of your expertise, of other resources that each applicant has already put into this. And that can look like land access, it can look like volunteer time, it can look like equipment, it can be actual cash. And that's why I would say that grant time up front is eligible, but it will be a stronger application if it's just one component of the match.
Yeah, and I was just going to reiterate too, like I mentioned, is we, said to a certain extent, we welcome you to be creative with that match. Like we said, we don't want it to be a barrier. So if you're going to an area and they're waiving the fee for you, include that in your match. That's an in-kind, essentially donation contribution. And then this table, I think I'm still sharing my screen. Here is like where Axie said, where you would include that breakdown in this table of kind of essentially where that match is coming from. And I see from Kate, you asked about if you're working with students from a Title I school, is that enough info for economics? Absolutely. If your students are coming from Title I schools, clearly that, they're 100% all qualify for free or reduced lunch, making them all low income. So definitely eligible. And that would be essentially enough for that question. I would say list, obviously the district or the school they're coming from and just spell that out for us. I see here question 5, are we to enter yes if our organization is the fiscal sponsor? You can hit no if the organization applying, if you are basically the eligible entity that is applying and you don't have a fiscal sponsor. You can just hit no, and then you should be able to move on from that question that asks then about who that is. So that we have some entities, that are apply can actually accept the funds, but are using a fiscal sponsor to accept them. So that's where that stems from. But if you're applying and you're eligible to accept the funds, and an eligible entity, then yeah, you could just hit no for that particular question. One other question, actually, I'll shoot this one to you. Is insurance for transportation eligible?
Yeah, insurance for transportation is eligible. We recognize that that can be a huge barrier. And so that's an eligible expense that falls under that transportation bucket. Again, keeping in mind that it's a programming grant, so we want to see in the application, how does that insurance, how does that transportation cost lead to more kids getting outside? And I think that's often pretty clear cut, right? That's what the application itself is going to be. But I just reiterate that point of any of these eligible expenses, keeping that main aspirational goal in mind.
Got another question here. Again, you guys feel free. I'm just reading from the question box, but feel free to actually verbally chime in. But this next question here is, actually, I'll let you go first if you want, but it says, if you can share, would love to hear what are some reflections, lessons learned from the first round of applications?
That's a great question. I feel like we could be here all afternoon talking about that, to be honest, because Alyssa and I talk about it all the time. I think about it all the time. How can we make this whole process better? I'll start maybe with something, I'll leave it at this. The number one thing that's on my mind right now, because this grant cycle is open, is just the Outdoor Equity Fund is entirely dependent on really good one-on-one, often outreach. This fund is dependent on people knowing about it and knowing about it throughout the state and not being blocked from applying because they didn't hear about a webinar, for instance, or they're not on the classic state communication channels. And so getting the word out there in all sorts of ways, from digital campaigns to social media, newsletters, in person. We haven't done a ton of in person this year, probably for really obvious reasons, but we always want to bump that up. We're actually driving to communities and talking about this, reducing those digital barriers, so we're not just relying on digital communication. Print ads, op-eds in newspapers, those earned media stories. I think these are just a few of the tools we have as basically organizers around this fund, and I think that that's crucial. So the lesson here is that I think we're always trying to make that outreach better, and you all joined this webinar today, so I'd be really curious to hear from people in the room how we can do better at this work, but it's also something that's always top of mind that Alyssa and I are kicking back and forth. How do we just improve this messaging, and how do we make the application itself more accessible?
I would just say from my end, in terms of reflections, lesson learned, and maybe more so some advice to you all that are in applying, is, really be intentional with your applications. We use an external review committee that come from a variety of different organizations, backgrounds, whether it be, they come from doing diversity inclusion work to maybe they actually are involved in outdoor work. There's a good mix of folks. So don't, I think, make any assumptions that they know who you are and they know the work you're doing. You're all doing great work. So I think that was just, sometimes with last year's applicants, you could tell they were doing good work, and they might be saying, oh, we're going to do this or that, and then leave it at that. But it's like, well, how are you going to do it? So don't be afraid to, obviously you're limited in some ways by some word limits, but definitely be intentional about spelling out the great work you're doing, because you all are doing great work. I see also, I think Megan, I see Megan's hand raised if you want to pop it in.
Yes, I had a question. Is there any restriction on using grant funds for software downloads if we're going to have participants using apps or things like that during their hikes or like walking tours?
No, that too is an eligible expense. I think we want to be broad-minded and creative with how we look at programming, and if there's some sort of digital tool that improves a kid's outdoor recreation access, or maybe addresses the education, the climate change education component of the grant, that's great. That's creative and wonderful, and we like to see that. And again, the more specific you can be, tying those software purchases with that end goal of, this is gonna teach 150 first graders about climate change in Diana County, whatever that is. But telling us that narrative is really gonna make your application stronger. And the short answer is that it is an eligible expense.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see any other hands raised, I don't think, but is there anyone else that wants to pop in and ask a question before I skip back to our question box?
Yeah, could I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Hi, this is Kate. Thanks so much for doing this. We work with middle school students and have them as agricultural interns. Can we use the fund as part of the payment for our students? Like, we reward them at the end of a season with a gift card, so they keep their hours and we reward them monetarily.
Yeah, at first blush, that is also an eligible expense. Again, keeping in mind this broad vision of how does that particular expense, how does applying the entirety of the Outdoor Equity Fund towards payments to students, make for broader, more accessible, more equitable outdoor recreation. And I think there's probably some really obvious ways that is true. But I think you just have to keep in mind that vision of the Outdoor Equity Fund, and that it is about that outdoor recreation experience. The only kind of caveat that I'm thinking about as you outline that is if it's a true paid internship, and that's maybe not what you're articulating here, but a true paid internship, there frankly might be better programs than the Outdoor Equity Fund if it is about connecting students, getting them living wages, working with an employer or a small scale agricultural outfit somewhere in New Mexico. So it's maybe a little bit of a gray area. Again, I'd say we want to be really broad with eligible expenses, and if it gets kids outside and gets this vision on the ground, then I think for the most part they're good to go. We just need to see that broader narrative.
I think that's where also, like I mentioned, we have a pretty diverse group of external review committees. So anytime you can make those connections and spell that out for them, it'll go a long way. Cool. Yeah, they come from different backgrounds, so don't assume they know the latest and greatest in all the outdoor rec programming and education. And then if there's anything that's questionable in that way, or that you're not sure about too, and then you're always welcome to reach out in the meantime to us in between these sessions as well to get clarification on things.
Great, thank you.
I'm gonna pop back over to the question box quickly. Let me.
I did have one more question.
You guys are shooting them in quickly.
I do have one more question if you guys have a chance.
Yeah, go ahead while I'm finding the last
are there
question
any
in the box that hasn't been answered.
Preferences or general thoughts about backcountry versus front country outdoor experiences? So if students are going to be recreating and hiking outside, but it's something that's pretty close to town versus something that's way out in a national park or state park or something like that, as far as eligibility goes and just general preference.
That's a great question. I can take a first stab at it, and just it broke up on my end for just a second, but the question is there any preference in scoring for that, like quote unquote, like let's say front country, closer to town in the city versus backcountry, like public lands, national parks? That's the question, right?
Yes, that's what I was asking. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's wonderful, because I'd say like there is definitely no preference, and I think that is one of the beautiful things about the Outdoor Equity Fund is, again, also we take a really broad look at what outdoor recreation is, and that can be getting a bunch of kids in a park in the bosque on a school day, for instance. There's certainly no preference or like scoring benefits from taking kids way out and going backpacking in the sun grace for 4 days. That's great, but both of them are great. And I think we recognize that for a lot of us, outdoor recreation actually does look like in our schoolyards or in our cities and in our backyards, and the more emphasis we can put on that, I think the better. So that's the big picture, and really I would say the only preference we put is on that nature-based, so going to parks versus soccer practice. Nothing against soccer practice, but we're just trying to have a really specific view at what that nature-based recreation is, while also being really broad with how we define it, and also trying to steer keep a line, right? Just because I think that there is actually quite a bit less funding for that nature-based recreation, but it can certainly be close to home, and we welcome that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, that's a large part of this equity piece, is just increasing that access, and I think in a lot of kids' minds as well, even adults now, you think of outdoor recreation as, I've got to have all this big, expensive, fancy gear to get into the backcountry, and that's all it is, versus I know we awarded last year a program that was just, you meet up around town and then we walk to the park and do some plant identification. That's also outdoor recreation. So I think it's teaching kids that as well, that it doesn't have to be some big inaccessible participation. All right, hopping back to the question box quickly. Would an applicant be penalized in this scenario? The applicant applies and has a partner who will provide services as part of the program to be proposed. The service provider may also apply, but for their work at their headquarters in another part of the state. So I'd say in that particular scenario, you would not be penalized. And we know New Mexico is a small state. So I think, Kathy, I don't know where you're coming from, but the best example I think for that scenario is that we've come across, and is we know that there's partners out there like Cottonwood Gulch that partner with other organizations to take their kids out to provide some experiences. As part of your application, if you're partnering with them, relying on them to do that, and then they apply themselves for their own programming and work, that's totally fine and totally separate. It's different, however, if say you apply and then they apply for the same thing, to take your kids with your program out. So we essentially have two applications for the same thing, then yeah, that becomes an issue. But if you're applying separately and it's part of yours, they're providing you that service, and then they're applying for their own separate programming, then yeah, there's no issue with that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. This is me. This is Kathy, and thank you for answering that question. It's so funny you mentioned Cottonwood Gulch, because that is our partner, and I'm in Bernalillo County, and they provide a lot of services for us, with us, and so that was the question. We were concerned about that. So thank you very much.
Yep, that's exactly where mine went to. I know that they do a lot of great work and partner with a lot of other entities to provide that service, and so I'm happy that my mind was right on. And Axie's still on, by the way, just so you all know. She's got her camera off. Just internet issues. So
hi everyone. I would prioritize audio, so I'm still here.
Next question that's come in is, should we apply with our same proposal as last year, or is more weight given to new projects and or different proposals? Axie, I'll let you pop in there if you want.
We don't have any scoring around new proposals, and we're not here to, the Outdoor Equity Fund isn't prioritizing like a flashy new proposal that we've never seen. So you know, if you have the same, you either have a project that you proposed that wasn't funded, or you have a project that you proposed and was funded, and either is fair game to propose again. I think we are going to want to see, and I know we keep hitting on this, right, but just that broader narrative, how does it get more kids outside? And that might be the same program year after year. We're happy to talk with folks one-on-one if your project wasn't funded on maybe how to even strengthen that application. Although also the big caveat there I would add is that it was an intensely competitive process. So maybe you applied and you had an awesome program and it just barely didn't make the cut. So there's kind of a few of those scenarios that I could envision, but the short, clear answer is that there's no mandate to propose something new, so long as your vision and the goal remains aligned with the Outdoor Equity Fund.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on that is, or just for some of you that may not be aware, last year we had roughly $275,000 to award, and the request through the applications was 1.25 million. So like Axie said, that made it more than competitive. We were only able to award obviously a small number of those applications. And I will also say that this year as well, there will be maybe a couple bugs that are the same, but for the most part, a new external review committee. So even if you apply with your same proposal, it will likely be essentially brand new to a lot of these folks that are reviewing and scoring it. Next question is, can the fund be used for marketing to recruit kids about an outdoor program? Axie, I'll shoot that one to you too.
Again, on first blush, I'd say that is an eligible expense. I'll be frank that if that's the only expense, then it really isn't eligible. Like, it has to be part of that programming. But if it's like, you know, we're going to take a portion of the Outdoor Equity Fund money that we are awarded, and we're going to use it to reach more kids with this holistic view of getting kids outside on the land. If you can tie that together and show us how you're actually using a portion of the fund to do that, that's really what we would need to see in the application. Because and I will probably sound like a broken record, but you have to think about it as a programming grant and an experiences grant. And so we don't want it to stop there at the letting kids know about it. And that might be a really key part of it. I recognize that, but because it is so programming focused, it has to be part of a broader vision. So again, it's a little bit complicated. I think the bar is probably a little higher to show how are you getting that message out there, and then how are you making sure that these kids actually experience the outdoors. We obviously get a lot of applications from groups that have these really deep relationships and connections with schools or with other communities, with young people, and so we're definitely open to hear the argument why some marketing is needed, but it does have to have that programming as the end goal. Yeah, that's the short answer. Anything else you would add, Alyssa?
No, but I'm going to shoot this next one to you just because it's somewhat related in that, can we use the funding for translation and interpretation services?
Yes, definitely. And again, I think you have to keep that North Star metric in mind, and how does this get more kids recreating? How does it tie to programming? But I think translation and interpretation is a really key part of that hands-on experience, that sense of belonging. So that too is an eligible expense. I think the caveat here is that it isn't, it's not an infrastructure grant, right? So it's really not intended to fund signage, and that's maybe not what you have in mind. I think that's obviously, it can be a broader category, but I'll use this as a way to cite something that wouldn't be eligible, and that's physical signage. If you're going to apply for a $20,000 Outdoor Equity Fund grant to do some of that kind of infrastructure interpretive work, that wouldn't be eligible. We actually have another grant that would fund that. But if it's part of that larger programming, part of an education curriculum, part of the recreation experience itself, that would all be totally fair game.
Next, anybody want to hop in? I see everyone that's stuck a question in, and we'll get to them, but anyone verbal questions that are itching to go? All right, well, feel free to chime in whenever. I'm going to skip to this next one. Is there a way to download the draft from Submittable? That's a great question. And that's honestly a question I might recommend you shoot over to Submittable. Again, there's this blue help button up here. As good as they are about getting back, they could probably get you an answer back to that quicker than it would take me to explore and figure it out myself. And we're also limited essentially on.
I just opened the grant application and I did a select all, control A, control copy, and then, you know, pasted it into a Word document because I didn't see that either. And then you have your questions.
Yeah, and I know we're somewhat limited in what we can see. It may not be exactly the same things you guys see on your end. So that, yeah, it's an excellent suggestion for whoever just spoke up and provided that. And other than that, yeah, I would shoot that question to Submittable, and you, like I said before, typically would have that answer in within a few hours at the least. Would developing outdoor school gardens or learning spaces be okay? Axie, you want to take that one?
Yeah, that would all be eligible with the idea of like close to home, accessible outdoor recreation. I think gardening, birding, like nature awareness and learning is all eligible. Again, with just that emphasis on recreation, like kids getting their hands dirty, and maybe that's gardening in a school plot, or it's going for that walk in the bosque and looking at plant identification. So broad strokes is that it is eligible, again with the idea towards programming and that outdoor experience versus infrastructure development, like building an outdoor classroom or something like that. It's more about the use and the experience.
Oh, yeah. I also wanted to see if introducing children to skiing might also qualify.
Skiing?
Yes, skiing.
That definitely also qualifies. I think, yeah, it's nature-based outdoor recreation, and I know that professionally we work with a lot of the ski areas in the state, and I know many of them are eager to work with more kids. So that's great. More power to you, and we'll be excited to see that application.
And Lisa, I see the second part of your question about that Axie answered around outdoor school gardens and learning spaces. You asked, could the match be the construction needed to develop these spaces? And it absolutely could. I think to reemphasize what Axie said is, you know, your best bet here would be to apply for that programming piece, to provide some of that material and equipment needed to provide that actual programming. And then if the match is the actual construction, that would be, I think that's perfect. Yeah, I think short answer, yes, that's the eligible match. It would absolutely work. Axie, I'm going to shoot this one to you because it's fresh on our minds because we just talked about this earlier. The question is, how is Samia Strategies involved?
That's a great question. Yeah, Samia Strategies is working on big picture outreach around the Outdoor Equity Fund. So they're working most closely with Kay and the Wilderness Society is how this relationship really came about. And they are professionals in the space of Black, Indigenous, and businesses led by people of color, communities of color, making sure that outreach reaches all of these groups and not just silos within the state, making sure we're being really intentional with who knows about the Outdoor Equity Fund, how people learn about it, and getting technical assistance on how to apply. So that's the big picture overview of Simia Strategies relationship with this stage of the Outdoor Equity Fund, and happy to follow up with more details or introduce you to folks at that great group.
Next question, would theater performances dealing with environmental issues and performed in local natural settings, such as a natural amphitheater, work for the purpose of this grant? Sorry, I was reading it really slowly because I was thinking about it. Actually, I don't know if you have initial thoughts.
I think the same thing. Like, I hate to say no, but you also, I think, really have to think about how is this nature-based outdoor recreation? How are these kids getting their hands dirty and learning about the lands and the waters of New Mexico? And my first thought, like in a theater, even if it's outside, it starts to be more classic, potentially after school programming or theater and arts programming, which is awesome. And we are so supportive of that. And that is wonderful if you can bring in some environmental learning. I think that the bar would be higher to make the case on how this is nature-based outdoor recreation. Not saying you can't, because there actually might be really creative ways to do that I am just not creative enough to think, to piece together. But that's my first answer, is that it's pretty borderline, I think, based on that definition of nature-based, in the lands, on the water, and really tying this with an understanding of the New Mexico ecosystem, of conservation, and of climate change.
That is the, Michael, I don't know if you want to chime in, ask anything further beyond that, if that hit it at all.
Yeah, I think that gave me a good general idea, and we have some ideas that I think will work really well within those directives. So we'll save them for the application. But as far as the initial answer, y'all gave me a good answer. Thank you.
Yeah, my mind goes even just to, like, I mean, going on, simple nature walks and hikes in these areas and learning about, like Axie said, the land, the water, where these performances may be taking place. A simple way to kind of meet that more of that nature-based programming aspect. Sounds like you've already got some ideas in mind yourself. So,
thank you.
Is there preference for applicants that already have existing partnerships with other outdoor recreational organizations?
We do ask for letters of support and links with other groups, not necessarily outdoor recreation associations. It could be a tribal natural resources department or a parks and rec department at a municipal level. For instance, I think often the strongest applications can show some of that connectivity, just who they're working with, but it's certainly not a mandate, and it's not necessarily even scored higher depending on how you answer the rest of the application. If you're proposing a new program, we want to reward that too. Maybe you don't have those relationships yet, or you have a vision for how to create them. We want to leave the door open for applications like that. So that too is really dependent on, like, what is that ultimate programming? What's the vision? What's the capacity to get these kids outside? And I think often capacity is broadened if you have more of those relationships, or if you're a group that's been working within a certain community for a long time. But it's not a prerequisite. And again, I think we just want to see in the application that story and that testimony to how are you contributing to equitable outdoor recreation access, and partnerships are maybe not part of that, but it kind of depends on how else, what else comes together.
Yeah, I don't think those partnerships are the end all be all in terms of an application being awarded, but I think if you have them, definitely tout them in your application. I know from last year's review committee discussions, yeah, that's just something that folks would say as well. They had really, they had really good partners. They listed really good partners. So again, that's not necessarily, that's not the determining factor in whether an application gets awarded, but if you have them, definitely showcase them. And actually, question here for you that just said, can you talk more about I think this was in response to this last question, can you talk more about that distinction you just made between traditional after school time / programs and outdoor recreation?
One way I think about it is after school sports, which are also like wonderful, right? So we're not trying to make any like judgment calls here. But like after school sports are not eligible. And that's just us trying to create this distinction and this emphasis on nature-based outdoor recreation. Classroom-based environmental education or classroom-based like the STEM-based curriculum, that might be eligible, but it also might not, depending on the outdoor recreation component. So I think that's the distinction I'm trying to draw, with the real emphasis on the nature-based outdoor recreation. How are kids getting outside on the lands, on the waters, and learning about these places in a formal way, in an informal way. It's about fun and recreation with that education component, but what that education component looks like is going to be really different depending on who's applying. So that's where my head goes, and hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that's, just to, again, I think we're starting to sound like a broken record, like Axie said, but we've seen applications in the past that are eligible and that totally work for that nature-based side, where part of the programming does take place in an after-school setting, indoor classroom type setting, whether that's at an actual school or Boys and Girls Club or wherever that may be, and we do a learning aspect there. But then we also, tied to that, is now we sit inside and we learn about insects. Now we go outside and we do a nature walk, nature study. We go outside and actually have that piece, nature based piece, where we're actually then looking for these insects and we're doing additional learning there as well. Just to, again, re-emphasize that piece. And that's the last question I have on my end, at least that I see in our question box. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in, has any additional ones?
I had one more question. How explicitly should our programming address climate change? Or concerns about climate change?
Yeah, that's another piece that was written into essentially the creation of the fund, where and it can be, obviously we'd love to see the climate change, but it can also just be an environmental and kind of more general environmental education and/or / climate education piece. And essentially that's just something that needs to be included in some form or fashion, and it's not, I would say, necessarily a huge aspect of the application, but it does need to be in there. And that can be anything from something that's as formal as, a written climate curriculum type education piece, or it can be, more informal, that we're going to bring in, we're going to invite our elders on this trip into the mountain with us, and they're going to teach us about how much the snowpack has changed and decreased over time. So it can be kind of as formal or informal as whatever makes sense for your program, but it is something that needs to be in there and describe that for us.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I know the funding has to be primarily for the programming. I'm a bit confused about the application, how it's rated. Would you say it's rated on the description of the programming, or how are we gonna, or also rather, how are we gonna take kids outside?
So jump in there.
Each portion, for the most part, the majority of the application is scored. And so that includes everything from that. And it's scored internally via, and then it's scored internally by our external review team. And so they go through, you know, and they go through this whole application, and on the back end, they score answers. One of those answers is the big picture program. How does this proposal that you're putting forth lead to more equitable outdoor recreation access? But that's really just the start, right? Then it homes in on other areas where it's going to be scored depending on the answer that you're putting forth. One of them is a good example of what we were just talking about with that education plan. Certainly not getting scored higher if it's that kind of formal curriculum-based lesson plan, but we do want to see that the applicant thought through how this can be educational for the youth. And that, I think, is really broad, right? Education can be really broad. You all are the experts in this space, so we just want to hear from you. How is this beneficial, educational? This is another one, equity. How does your program contribute to equitable access to outdoor recreation for New Mexican youth? Again, we want to hear from the experts. You all do this work every day. How would you answer this question? And then this is one of the questions that our evaluation committee scores. So it's not, hopefully this answers that. Maybe I don't mean it to be convoluted, but most of the application is scored, including both the summary, but then also some of these more specific answers.
Okay, ma'am, perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I'm sorry, I have one more question, guys. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
How would you guys recommend, do you guys recommend doing more exposure of different types of outdoor activities, or would you guys recommend on just focusing on one type? Let's say just hiking and biking instead of doing swimming and camping and all that.
Well, that's a really good question too. And that's, I mean, to your earlier question about scoring, one of the ways that this application is not scored is by like number of outdoor recreation activities. So, you know, if you're proposing one activity, let's say it's walking, that scores the same as if you were proposing like, jet skiing, hunting, and hot air ballooning, to name three super random ones that I'm just looking at. If that fits in, that's great. And if it's a natural fit for you and for the kids and for the application, then that's awesome. But it's really about following your lead, following the leader's lead, the person who's applying, as well as what's best for the kids, for the community. And it's not being scored higher the more activities that are based in there. And there's also not any like type of activity that scores higher. This question in particular is just us trying to get a broad view of who's applying, and get a sense of what those activities are going to be even after the money's awarded. Some of it's just that research and data gathering.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that I mean, honestly, I think for most of the applications last year and with those awarded, they're pretty focused. You know, most of them didn't go beyond a couple, maybe a handful of these activities. There was a lot of them that were specifically doing fly fishing, and that's great. You know, ones that were specifically biking in the bosque, again, great. So just to emphasize that plenty awarded last year that were just very focused on doing one thing and doing it well rather than spreading it out, which is also great. If you have the capacity to introduce lots of activities, obviously we'd love to see that as well. Any other last questions? That's all I have on my end, Axie, from the box and from, sounds like, everyone else.
Well, thanks for leading this today, Alyssa, and thank you for the wonderful questions, everyone who tuned in. I hope that this has been helpful, and we mean it when we say we want feedback on the whole process, the outreach, the application itself, any of it. So we try and be really responsive. We'll be having one more of these same sessions in just 2 weeks. You can find that registration info on our website. It's on June 23rd, and our website's nmoutside.com. So if you have any other lingering questions, that's another good opportunity to get both of us on the line for an hour. And in the interim, shoot us an email, shoot us a text, give us a call. Good luck with your application, and thank you so much for tuning in.